In assignment 05A, we're going to create an app where we simulate rolling a pair of dice 1,000 times. And we want to keep track of how many times those dice come up as snake eyes. It would be a roll of 2 versus a roll of 12, so 2 6s. And of course, mathematically, a 7 is going to be the most common. 3 plus 4, 5 plus 2, 6 plus 1. We want to chart out the number of times that each of those rolls come up. And we should get basically a little bell curve or for a bar chart. So that's our assignment. This is going to give us some practice in loops as well as using arrays. Although you could do this without arrays if you preferred. It's just going to make it a little bit simpler. So originally I had an assignment version where we just counted the number of rolls, and then I chose to add labels to create the bar chart. We're going to use the arc4random_uniform method to randomly generate a value between 1 and 6 for each of our die. And of course, we're going to roll 2 die. And then I give a tip for how to enhance with using the labels. I use a label array in which each label is referenced in an array, and then we can iterate through a loop. And I'll show you how to do this both in Storyboard and in SwiftUI. It's a little more challenging in SwiftUI in this case to set up those bindings for the widths of the arrays or the widths of the labels. You'll see here I give a little tip here in terms of setting the width mathematically. As I played around with this a little bit more recently, I thought, gosh, we should make the longest bar be 200 pixels. That's sort of the value that I determined was the max that fit on the phone, or 200 units. Why don't we do a little different math and find the maximum value. We'll take each roll and divide it by the maximum roll. That'll give us a value between 0 and 1. So 1 times 200, since our largest bar will be 200 units, would give us the largest bar, whether it's a 6, 7, or 8. It's going to be the most common 7, but could be 6 or 8. Once in a great while, probably not for 1,000 rolls, we're going to get 5 or 9. But then every other bar will be relative to the max bar. So here's just the simple adjustment that I made in the code for that in determining the width of the bar frame. Let's look at this in Xcode. We'll look at the storyboard project first for solving the 1,000 dice rolls. And I have basically 11 rows of content for each of the roll combinations from 2 to 12. And on each row here, I have a label with the word 2, 3, 4, 5, so forth. And then I have a text field that will contain the number of rolls. And then the red bar here is also a label. And I set the width of it to 200 units. And we'll use that mathematically in determining what the maximum width is for our roll. It's usually going to be a 7 or maybe a 6 or 8 once in a while. So I just simply created that first row, duplicated it, pasted it 10 more times, and just changed the values in terms of the text in the label on the left. Then I created a button with a caption of roll 1,000 times. Let's take a look at our view controller. So those text fields I did set up as outlets. So we have our 2 text, 3 text, 4 text. They're all UI text fields. I also created outlets for the bars, and I named those bar 2, bar 3, bar 4 down to bar 12. So those are also UI labels. Then I created an action for the button. And here's our button action. So I have an array called myRolls, which is of type integer. And it contains values, actually contains 13 values. The first is index 0, we're going to ignore that. Index 1 is also 0, we're going to ignore that. The indices we're going to use are 2 through 12. And this makes it mathematically easy to correspond to our rolls of 2 to 12. So we're going to ignore basically index 0 and index 1. I do the same thing of creating an array of type UI text field. Those are going to be those 11 text fields that we have. Again, I want to ignore the first 2, so I have 2 text, 2 text, and 2 text. So we're going to ignore the first 2. This third one is element 2, and then we have 3 text, 4 text, and so forth. So this will allow us to iterate through those text boxes in a loop and make our code much shorter. I have a for loop. I'm going to go from 1 to 1,000. We're going to randomly generate our first die and our second die, add those together, get the total, and then we'll take that total and we're going to increment the appropriate index of my roles. So if the total is a 2, we'll increment index 2 of my roles. If it's a 7, we'll increment element 7 of my roles. Then I've got a loop going from 2 to 12 with variable I. So I will start with the value of 2, and each time through the loop, we're going to set the value of the text of that text box element I. That's coming up here. So the first time it's going to be 2 text. That's going to be element 2. I'm going to set the text of 2 text to the string value of my roles element I. And that will populate the numerical values of our 11 different role values. Then I've got another array here of type UI label. This is going to be our labels for the bar chart. So we're going to ignore index 0 and index 1. We'll start with index 2, bar 2. So I could have named these first two anything I wanted, but we have bar 2, bar 3, bar 4. And then again, we're going to iterate through this to set the width of our labels. So I showed you earlier, I wanted to find the maximum value of my roles. So maybe it's we rolled a 7 227 times. I then want to divide in a loop each of the other roles by that max value, which will give me a value between 0 and 1. And so we'll divide that roll by the highest. I'm going to say the default value is 200. If we had 1,000 rolls and we somehow rolled a 5 all 1,000 times, I'm going to set that value to 200. It's not going to happen, obviously, but that's the fallback. And then we'll simply set the frame of bars 1 to the bar frame. So we're changing the width of that bar frame. So we're creating a bar frame, and then we're setting that bar frame of that element I to the bar frame. Here's an alternative approach. If you didn't want to use arrays, you could do this the long way with each individual bar being done. So you see the value of using arrays makes it much quicker, makes it much easier. On this one, I didn't bother to do the dividing by the biggest roll value. So these may not extend all the way out consistently to the right-hand edge. But you can make that adjustment. So that's our storyboard version. Let me just run this. And I click roll 1,000 times. And there we see our bar chart. 7 is going to be the largest in this case. And notice it doesn't change as I roll through because that's always the longest in this case. So everything else is relative to that. So that base is the kind of the 100% bar. And once in a while, if I do a bunch of times here, we might see 6 or 8 be more here. 6 and 7 are the same. And their 6 is just a little bit more than 7. Doesn't happen very often, but mathematically is a possibility. Let's take a look at the SwiftUI version of this. Here's the SwiftUI version of our 1,000 dice rolls project. And I started by going into the assets and created a color of deep purple that I'm going to make my bars. You can do any color you like. Let's go to the content view. And so as we did before, we want basically 11 rows with a static text of the roll value, the number of times it's rolled, and then a bar for a bar chart that will visually depict the distribution of those rolls. I'm going to create 2 variables that are state variables that we can bind to for our values in the text fields as well as the length of our bars. So I have my roles as a type integer, and as we saw in the storyboard, the first 2 indices of this array are going to be ignored. We're going to start with element 2 that will relate to our value of 2, and then element 12 is the last one. So there's 13 elements in our array since we start with 0. Same thing with our bar width. This is going to be of type float, and so the first 2 are 0.0, and then I set all the others to 200.0. So initially we're going to get bars going all the way over to the right before we click roll 1,000 times. We have a VStack, And inside that VStack, I added another VStack. Now the question is, why would I add a VStack inside a VStack? Well, the limitation on the number of children in a container, whether it's a VStack or an HStack or even a ZStack, is 10. And we've got 11 rows here. So I created a VStack that's going to contain our rows for the totals of 2 through 11, and then another VStack to contain that last row and our button. Each row here is a horizontal stack with a text control. In that text control, I put a literal value of 2 colon, and I aligned that trailing so everything aligns here on the right, gave it a width of 75, and then the text field is this box that we see here. The placeholder is 0, but the value of that is going to bind to my roles index 2. And the formatter, number formatter, allows us to take that integer value of our array and convert it to a string. Set some padding. I gave it a frame width of 80. And I made it trailing. I want to have my numbers over here on the right-hand side. Then my bar coming here is just a rectangle shape. And I gave it a frame width that is tied to my bar width array element 2, and I gave it a height of 33. And gave it the foreground color. Here's where we use that asset of deep purple. What I did then was copy that HStack and simply paste it. And each time I pasted, I changed the text that was in the text control, changed the binding to the index of my roles for the text field, and changed the binding for the bar width array for the frame of my rectangle. So I did that for 4, for 5, for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now I hit that max of 10 children in that vertical stack. So I end the vertical stack, and now I create another vertical stack. I'm copying in that HStack again. This is going to be for 12. So changing the value for the text, the binding for the text field, the binding for the width of the rectangle. Then I do a little spacer here. I want to bring my button down a little bit. And another HStack with a spacer and a button and a spacer that helps put my button in the center. Because again, this is left aligned or leading. And for the button, text is roll 1,000 times, and it's going to call a method called roll'em. Set some padding, the colors, the weight of the font, a little padding of that whole entire VStack that everything is contained in. And then here's my method for roll'em. Very similar to what we did in the storyboard. I'm going to reset my roles to be all 0 values. So if I run this more, I don't want to keep adding to what's there before. If I click that roll 1,000 times button sequentially, each time I want to 0 out those values. I'm going to roll my dice 1,000 times, same way we did in the storyboard, using arc4 random _ uniform, getting the value of 6. It's a value of 0 to 5. Adding 1 to it gives us a value of 1 to 6. Add those together, and then I'm going to increment my roles, the index, by 1. I want to find the maximum value of my roles. So that's the myRoles.max. Since that is an optional value and could be empty, I'm going to set a default value of 1,000. Again, we're never going to roll a 7 1,000 times in 1,000 rolls. And then here's the loop to change the width of those rectangles. I'm setting bar width element n. So we're going for a loop 2 to 12. For each n in that loop, we're going to take my roles element n, whatever the number of rolls is for that particular roll, divided by max. I'm going to multiply it by 200 because our largest value would be itself divided by itself, since it's going to be the max. 200 is going to give us that full width bar. Everything else will be relative. So if we click just here in the preview, I click roll 1,000 times, and we'll see that work. We could, of course, run this in the emulator as well. So that's the value of arrays and doing some binding. A little bit more tricky in the SwiftUI to do that binding, but it works out very nicely. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the iOS app development cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.